We've been fighting a long time, and we have all lost so very much, so many loved ones gone. But you are not alone. There are pockets of resistance all around the planet. We are at the brink. You have no idea how important you are. If you're listening to this, you are the resistance.
Ave Maria Stella, Dei Mater Alma, atque semper Virgo, Felix te porta.
Welcome everybody, Steve with Personalism, coming at you with another book review. This one with called Economic Personalism, Property, Power, and Justice for Every Person. With, as you might recognize, Michael Greaney from the Socialism series and a couple other shows we've done, and Don Brohawn, who's the co-author of the book as well. So Don, welcome. Michael, glad to have you back.
Good
How
to
you
be
guys
here.
doing?
Actually, it's good to be here. I'm not there.
Yes. You're not here. You're there. Whenever, wherever you are.
Virtually, yes, in the webosphere.
Yes, even if it wasn't a weird time, we'd still be doing this. I'm not flying to Michael's lair to do this.
You don't want to.
So, who wants to take the first one? I guess ladies first. How about that? Why did you write the book?
Well, it's funny you should ask me to answer that first, because it really was started with Mike's book. I think we had been discussing how we could describe this set of ideas that I think Mike's been mentioning on some of your shows. And it started out actually as a request from an associate of ours who has contacts in the Vatican. And he wanted to have a single book which would explain our ideas in the context of John Paul II's writings on personalism. And so Mike had been doing a lot of research to begin with for many years on social justice. And we weren't actually aware of the scholarship of John Paul II on this concept, which interestingly enough, he wrote his dissertation on personalism, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. also wrote his dissertation on personalism. And so we saw a connection with our just third way concepts in terms of economics, which is a lower level of human activity than the whole social order, but it's a very important one. So we began to see a lot of parallels and connections, and Mike started writing, I would say mainly for Catholic audience. This was for Catholic scholars and clergy. And as I started reading it, I could see how the universal concepts that are expressed in the social encyclicals could be communicated to anyone. And so this is a book about principles, and it starts, well, we'll get more into what it's all about, but that's really the inspiration for how this book came about.
Yeah, it's probably the second or third shortest book I've ever written, and I think it took longer to write than anything else I've managed to publish. It was first requested as a one-pager, and then sort of expanded it, and then every time I thought I had the right outline, Don would look at it and go, You know how some people can just sort of look at something and make a noise without telling you something, and you just know it's not quite right. But I think we finally managed, after many iterations, to get something that I think really, this is the wrong way to say it, does the trick, because there's no trick about it. It's just basic common sense, a focus on human dignity, the dignity of actual human people, not the dignity of the collective. And these terms are more fully explained in the book, because there is a difference between humanity and human beings, which some people don't fully appreciate. You know, if I'm not being pejorative about it, they really don't grasp the fact that, and one of the things that I discovered years ago was that a lot of people mistake applications of principles for the principles. For instance, it's axiomatic in, ethics that, well, you pay a just wage to people. And they say, that's the principle. No, that's not the principle. The basic principle is justice, which is applied in a just wage. The just wage itself is not the principle. It's an application of a principle. I made that point in a couple of other books and many other articles. And one of our members of our advisory board, we call the CESJ Board of Counselors, Father Edward Krause, who is currently in residence at the University of Notre Dame. He used to teach social ethics at Gannon University in Pennsylvania. I was having a conversation with him when we were out in St. Louis for an event at the Central Union of the the Central Bureau of the Catholic Central Union of America there.
And he's an acrobat.
And he said, but you say that in all your books. I thought, well, people keep making the same mistake. I have to keep saying it. So in this book, what we did was lay out the principles of the just third way of economic personalism, and then show how with the progression applying the social doctrine of Pius XI, which is not the same as that of Leo XIII. It's a development on it, and of many other people, and also adding in the economic justice principles articulated by Louis Kelso and Mortimer Adler. Everybody knows Mortimer Adler, or at least they should. The great books, Philosopher. A lot of people know of Louis Kelso too, usually as the inventor of the employee stock ownership plan. But as we talk about, the confusion between principle and application of principle, there are a lot of people who think the ESOP, the employee stock ownership plan, is the great principle that Louis Kelso invented. No, that's an application of principles of economic justice that he developed prior to the first ESOP. The ESOP is an application of principle. Similarly, the whole area of economic personalism is based on these principles that we set out in this book, and we tried to show how going from basic principles of justice and personalism and human dignity, then it grows and you can apply these still in very broad ways in the book. The book doesn't get very specific on too many things. I mean, it's only 152 pages, so you can't get too specific. Every one of the subjects covered in the book deserves a multi-volume explanation. But
so the answer is because I wanted to.
Yeah.
Don, who's the target?
Because it's there. Why write a book? Well, because I felt like it.
Yeah, so that to keep a long story short or a short story long.
Why'd you write the book? Because I wanted to. Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
Somebody told me to, so I did it.
Don, who's the targeted audience?
Well, I think, as I said, initially it was for Catholic scholars, and we really are seeking to present these ideas to Pope Francis because we think that they'll help address a lot of the systemic problems that he sees in the world today, including the growing wealth gap, systemic poverty, inequality of opportunity, and many other ills, and war. We can see growing conflicts. And to the extent a lot of this has to do with the system which denies most people dignity and power over their own lives and futures. And you have a money system which is not based on real value. It's based on gambling and speculation, and people have forgotten that when you hold up a dollar bill, that should not represent a dollar's worth of the government's debt. It should represent a dollar's worth of real goods and services. And so we've really gotten away from some important basic concepts like justice, social justice, economic justice. I'm sure as you read and you interview people and what you hear discussions on the news, you can hear a lot of confusion about the term, for example, social justice. Now, we define it according to how Pope Pius XI defined it, and Father Free, and I won't get into a long dissertation on that because those are later questions that you're going to ask us.
You blew the secret up.
Yeah, but then I would say, because we saw this also as really a universal statement, and so we're hoping that this will get into academia. And we do have a friend and ally in one of the major US universities who also happens to be Catholic, but she's a professor of social work. And she teaches doctoral students and master's level students. So she could see how the just third way principles really address her field, but in terms of each individual human being. So the idea of power is very central to this idea, because we have the paradox that power, when it becomes concentrated, it corrupts or tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. On the other hand, every human being needs their own source of power so that someone else does not control their lives. So this becomes a balance, and it has to be built into the system. So in that way, this notion of how you structurally diffuse power is something that politicians and policymakers and business people and everyone should be concerned with. But this is a book really looking at systems and how you design a system to maximize human dignity for every person, and also have enable everyone to have equal access to the common good, which we also define according to Pope Pius XI's definition, that it's not an amorphous mass of all these things floating around. It really is the system, the structure of all of our institutions, our laws, our habits as social creatures, that it's there, like Father Free said, it's like the air. You possess it in its entirety, but it's there to help you develop as a human being. And if someone doesn't have equal access, for example, you had with the segregation or apartheid, most people did not have the same access to this. It's not giving you results. It's not promising you that, you're going to end up a billionaire. But what it's saying is, if you use this, if you take advantage of this, you learn and you apply this, you should be able to have enough of a base to provide for your sustenance, because you have material needs in order to survive, but also you should have available to you those systems and structures, processes that can help you develop your highest human potential. And then, as we say, go on to really work for the common good. And also in CESJ, our core values, we talk about the highest level of work, and that's how we relate to God, and how we relate to the rest of creation and to other people. So inevitably, ultimately, we hope this would reach everyone, but being realistic about marketing, I think, we start with the narrower niche.
Yeah. Basically, to make a moderately long story short, the target audience is anyone who is confused or exacerbated or just angry about the fact that it seems that the only way to improve things is to destroy things. Socialism attacks the haves, capitalism attacks the have-nots. We believe that the just third way of economic personalism doesn't attack. What it does is it goes and improves the fundamental institutions of the social order, which are, of course, reflections from the individual human person, not humanity. So that, yes, we can improve things for everybody without destroying them for anybody. Or as, I'm probably going to get it wrong, but as R. Buckminster Fuller said, and he said a lot of good things, but we like this one the best: how to make the world work for 100% of humanity without
in the shortest possible time, with spontaneous cooperation, without ecological offense or the disadvantage of anyone. So that we see is like the ultimate challenge to every person, every nation, the whole world. Can we do this? And Bucky Fuller saw that by redesigning our physical systems, how we interact with the environment and our natural resources, every person on Earth could have affluence, have enough to thrive on, and to really to pursue higher pursuits. There you go.
Yeah, somebody just told me that I was making erroneous errors.
Yeah, there you go. As I said, I'm not a morning person.
No problem. So what is, the title of the book is Economic Personalism. What is that phrase for someone that's, maybe it's the first time they heard of that?
Mike, you want to take a first shot at this?
I thought you were taking the first shot at everything.
Oh, okay. Well, no, I'm happy to do that. It's a system within a larger system of a social, the whole social order, which is addressed by personalism as the broader concept. But within that, it's a subset of personalism that deals with each person's relationship to the economy and to economic institutions such as money and credit and property and banking and tax laws, all of these things which affect our economic lives and our ability to generate an income for ourselves so we can consume and exchange with other people in the economy. So the reason economics and economic personalism is so essential is that in order to have social justice, to have a society where everyone has equal access to the common good, we have to look at what are our urgent needs. We have, Louis Kelso talked about the law of the urgent and the important. And the important things are, for example, people who go into the clergy, for example, teachers, lawyers, for that matter, legislators, that they're doing work that is important. But ultimately, those things we think, once, if people were affluent, then people would do those sorts of professions for free. It's because they love that work. But in order to do that, the economy has to be producing enough. And each person, this is a key thing, each person has to be producing enough. And so what's happened in the world is that we've moved from labor-intensive economies and maybe economies where we have more agriculture, but it's still labor-intensive. It needs human inputs, to one where increasingly the inputs are being made, the work is being done by technology, and now more artificial intelligence and robotics. And we can keep pretending that this is human labor being made more productive, and they talk about productivity. But this is, if you look at it, people get fired and the robots are put into operation because it's cheaper for business to do that. So the question is, in a modern world, how can each of us be productive? How can we produce economically? And that's not the most important part of our lives, but we have to be able to do that. So what Louis Kelso brought in, he was a successful corporate finance lawyer who knew how the idea of capital credit worked and how you repay with profits. He brought in a means whereby every person from the time they're born to the day they die can gradually acquire more and more of the new capital assets that are brought into the economy. And by doing this and not forcing them to have to save in order to invest, which is impossible for at least 90% of mankind. You look around the world, it's probably even a higher percentage. So how do you enable each person to become productive? And that's where the idea of connecting people to this right of property, this is very important. We talk about private property. What are your actual rights over the thing you own? And this is not the state, this is not other people, it's you as an individual. So economic personalism is looking at all those connections that we have to the process of production, and in order to serve and enhance our individual human dignity and provide us with the power so that we can secure our own freedom. So that's sort of a medium, short, long.
or to part 1A here. Essentially, what economic personalism does is get down to the brass tacks of how you actually carry out the meaning and purpose of life. Now, to get perhaps a little bit too esoteric or philosophical, the meaning and purpose of life, if you're an Aristotelian Thomist, is to acquire and develop virtue and become more fully human, thereby preparing yourself for your proper end. Now, to a Christian, of course, that's to be with God in heaven. I'm not, conversant enough with what other religions and philosophies will say is the true end that they're seeking, but that's not what we're discussing here. What it is you must, to prepare yourself for that end, you are to become more fully human. Now, how do you do that? By exercising your natural rights, among which are the most important ones of life, liberty, and access to the means of acquiring and possessing private property, and of course, carrying out acts of virtue, pursuing happiness, as Jefferson put it in the Declaration of Independence. Well, in order to have the power to carry out, to exercise your natural rights, you need ownership, either of labor, if that's the primary means of production, or of capital, if that's the primary means of production, or both, if they're combined. So that this is because, as Daniel Webster noted, exactly 200 years ago, finally I said that right. Every other time I've been interviewed, I said 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 1820. Power naturally and necessarily follows property. So even to become more fully human as an ordinary thing, you need ownership, both of labor and of capital, to give you the power that you need to exercise your rights of life and liberty. And so what we say in economic personalism is, okay, here is a practical means, as far as we can tell, and it does work. It's been proven to work. Perhaps not all together, but each separate part works. And of course, an engineer will tell you, if you can get the individual parts to work, it's just a matter of time before you get the whole system to work. So what economic personalism does is give a practical guide for how to structure an economic and a social system to achieve the end of becoming more fully human.
Oh, you're tossing it to me first.
Of course.
I thought Mike is writing a book on what happened to social justice. Mike,
Well,
why don't you take the
450
first?
pages long. I don't think you want that first.
No. Right. Well, you can look at it on two levels. One is the ideal that we're striving towards, and that is a condition whereby all of the common good is structured in such a way that everyone has equal access to it in order to enhance their dignity and their ability to develop more virtue. So that's the target that we're aiming at, and it's never perfect. And one of the problems also is in the question of participation, or what we would call participative justice. Does every person, in fact, have equal access, for example, to money and credit to become a capital owner? Well, we can see today that certainly isn't the case. Does everyone have equal access to a high quality education? Well, that's certainly not, and even clean water and clean air. So we see that all the things necessary for human beings to survive and thrive are not equally accessible. So then what do you do if there's an institution, for example, the laws of segregation? You have to change the laws. And then how do you change the laws? Well, no one person can change a system. by him or herself. It can only happen by people organizing together, sharing common principles, common vision, common values, who are able to see, okay, what specifically is the problem in the system that needs to be changed or fixed? And then by using various, and this is, you may use the power of many people, people power, for example. You may use the power to identify leaders who have the influence and ability to change laws, which we in CESJ were able, our founders were able to do by getting to Senator Russell Long. And this was back in the, I think it was the early 70s, as a matter of fact. He was the second most powerful person in the Congress. And he had been, and I say this being the daughter of someone who was involved in getting these laws changed to enable employees to become owners of their companies using employee stock ownership plans. And there's a whole history behind this, but Russell Long turned out to be just a godsend, a powerful champion of worker ownership through these methods. And he came from, he was the son of someone who was a redistributist, Huey Long, and he did not believe in the Robin Hood approach to economic development or improving society. So
Russell
he
Long
preached,
did not.
yeah, Russell Long, right. Huey Long was the opposite.
Definitely did.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no. So this, yeah, and that was very important. But so that's another way is through education, organizing, for example, what we're trying to do with Justice University and spread these online forums around the world so people can learn about these ideas, discuss them, and also learn how to apply them. And then you have the idea of successful models, which we have in terms of companies, employee-owned companies. And we're looking now beyond that, as this is a later topic of how we extend this equal access to capital ownership, not just to corporate employees, but to every child, woman, and man in society, citizens, starting with citizens. And so that social justice is the act of organizing. Mike, you want to add to that?
Yes, actually, but a little commercial here. One of the reasons why the book, Economic Personalism, is the first publication of Justice University Press to underscore the fact of why we are organizing Justice University. Now, it's a good thing that you're asking Dawn these questions first, because if I were to, when my part is incomprehensible unless you've heard her part, which is social justice has gone through what we can call 3 stages of development. The first stage was when it was, well, 4 if you want to, but at first the term social justice, which came in the late 1820s, 1830s, it was used for everything. It was a really nice sounding term, so you used it to mean whatever you wanted it to mean. But then as the 1830s drew on, people began to use it to mean, redistribution. It was a socialist term that the socialists captured even before they were called socialists. The term socialism, by the way, only was invented about 1832. We won't get into that. But in the late 1830s, a man named Monsignor Aloysius Luigi Taparelli, and he has another part of his name that I can't pronounce. He was a Jesuit, but one of the good ones. He developed a principle of social justice, which was, to contrast, the socialist concept of social justice was the end justifies the means. In order to have a material good life for everyone, anything goes. Abolish private property, abolish marriage and family, abolish government, abolish organized religion. Anything that gets in the way of what the socialist, a specific socialist defined as happiness, had to be eliminated. Robert Owen's infamous speech on the 4th of July, 1826, on the 50th anniversary of American independence, called for in New Harmony, Indiana, unfortunately, called for the abolition of private property, organized religion, and marriage and family. And years later, over a century later, Fulton Sheen called for a declaration of mental dependence. So, a declaration of dependence that we do need organized religion. We do need marriage and family. We do need government. You can't just abolish them to establish the perfect society. The end does not justify the means. What Taparelli said was that what social justice means is that within the framework of natural law, and of course for Catholics within the magisterium of the church, he defines social justice as individual acts with an eye to the common good. In other words, everything you do should take into account its indirect effect on society. Don't do anything, even if it's great for you, that will cause harm to other individuals, other groups, or the common good as a whole. And the common good is this vast network of institutions within which people become more fully human. Of course, very technically and philosophically defined, the common good is every human being's analogously complete capacity to become more fully human. So, but it's realized in society as this vast network of institutions. Okay, that was social justice, although rarely used until the election of Pius XI in 1922. It was a vague concept when it essentially meant no more than Aristotle's legal justice, but with a Christian whitewash on it. And basically the socialists captured the term so that even today people think that social justice means the end justifies the means, whatever you want to do in order to redistribute so that people have enough to live on, so or whatever you want them to have.
So you also hear this phrase economic justice. Well,
in social justice, what Pius XI did was say, no, social justice is not just another word for legal justice, a general justice, a good intention to the common good. He said, no, it's a particular virtue with a defined act. See, under the Taparelli notion of social justice, it was you do an individual act that has an indirect effect on the common good. In the way Pius XI defines social justice is it's the particular virtue directed to the common good. Its effect on the common good is direct, not indirect. And this is what most socialists, actually all socialists, and most people can't grasp. Social justice does not affect any individual good directly, only indirectly by directly affecting institutions. And how do you affect institutions? Because institutions are social things, you can only affect them as a member of a group, as a member of an organized effort to, benefit that institution. So that you have individual virtue, which is direct good for the individual, but indirect for society, and social virtue, which is direct on society, but indirect on individuals. Now, aren't you glad that Don spoke first?
Yeah, and one small thing that, Father Ferry's introduction to social justice is a beautiful piece for everyone should read it so that they can really understand the concept of social justice. And he talks about the laws and characteristics of social justice and how you apply them. But what was really just sort of, a recent revelation to me, because I read this over and over, Intro to Social Justice.
And it's available as a free download on the CESJ website in the free ebook section, as is Economic Personalism.
Yes, so thank you for mentioning that, Mike.
Always add the commercial.
Oh. But what I didn't understand was when you talk about a virtue as something, for example, on the individual level, how you interact with other people, how does the individual receive the reward that he or she is due? I was always grappling with the question of, how does the individual person connect up with this act of social justice? When you talk about a social virtue, what does that mean? Because I couldn't see how you got it down, this requirement, actually, when you're in the midst of an institution that's unjust, you are morally required to act upon that to correct the institution. But Father Free says you're not called to do the impossible, and it's impossible to fix an institution by yourself, because it's many social interactions and traditions, etc. Social habits. And what does social habits mean? Is this the habit of the institution? Well, in a sense, the way it's constructed, whether the principles of justice are embedded in its structure, but that wasn't it. It was really this idea that each of us is responsible for our own levels of the common good. So this could be, for example, even within our own companies, within our own families, within our own schools, going level to level, our voting systems, those areas of the common good in which we interact, our milieu is the word Father Free used. And it becomes much more manageable if you understand that, so that you individually are not expected to necessarily go out, form a little group and change the world. Although your actions, you can, and this is something which you have to understand the levels of the common good, which would actually transform systems on a global level. Okay, but for most people, they're going about their daily lives. They go to church, they go to school, they go to work, and it's at those levels which they have to be constantly aware. Is there unfairness? Are some people being excluded? Does everyone have equal access to this institution? And if not, if one single person does not have that equal access, it is all of our obligation to organize to correct that systemic problem. And we're talking about just within the areas we have influence and power in. So that, suddenly realizing that, what does that mean in terms of my own responsibility as a human being? And it's never asking me to do the impossible, but it is saying we do have to care for the common good at all its levels. And also, as we fix our own institutions, we have to always think about the higher levels and the lower levels of the common good, and that ultimately it's improving everything. It's not at the cost of another level of the common good. So this is a multi-textured way of looking at the common good, and it brings it down to human scale. So, that was something that was sort of a personal revelation to me.
Yeah. Another point that Father Free liked to make, because people think of doing social justice. Oh, well, we need to schedule an act of social justice for 3:30 today, so we'll go out and we'll do social justice. Then we'll go home and pat ourselves on the back and have a feeling of extreme virtue and have a drink or something. He said, no. Social justice, if done properly, is not that you're doing something extra. You're doing what you ordinarily do in a different way. And in a sense, this is what Benedict the 15th, without, not the 16th, the 15th, back in 1914, when he laid out the principle of social justice without calling it that, when he was referring to what the modernists and the reactionaries and all the crazy people were doing, which he blamed World War I on the socialists and the modernists, by the way. He said, in his first encyclical, he said, old things, yes, but in a new way. In other words, don't just jettison everything old, but be prepared to do the things you're doing in new ways in order to have the proper effect.
All right, so it goes into what is economic justice. That's another buzzword phrase, like a buzz phrase that you hear a lot about.
I think that Louis Kelso and Mortimer Adler, as far as we know, were the first to define it in terms of a system, in terms of 3 system principles that relate to the productive process and how people contribute either their labor or their capital and how they get their just distribution. So they're looking at economic justice as the virtue that structures your economy so that every human being has access to the means to participate fully in the economy. And this might mean with your labor, or it may be through your ownership, you're contributing the equipment or whatever capital assets in order to produce things that will be sold, exchanged and sold. So it was, the way they presented it was in terms of three overriding or three fundamental principles. One is your input principle, how you contribute, how you participate. That was, we call it participative justice. The output principle, which is how you get your just return for what you contributed. And we call that distributive justice. And it's in terms of how you would compare this with what's called commutative justice, which is generally direct exchanges between specific, maybe one party with another. With distributive justice, you have the problem of, okay, we've produced all these things by combining our labor and capital. Now, how do we determine what each person should get, their fair share of this? And so that gets into the notion of, well, should this be done in an arbitrary way? Should this be done according to need? You have one worker with 12 children and you have one worker with no children. And maybe that one, who knows, the parent of the 12 children maybe isn't contributing as much to what is actually produced in the company, and the other one is. So is it fair, based on need, to give the parent with 12 children more because they need it? So Kelso and Adler were very specific about the difference between justice and charity, both being necessary principles, but we don't want to confuse them. And I think that's a big problem with how people use the word economic justice, is they now base it on what people need. Well, what Kelso was able to come up with was a way that anyone could, now not everyone's labor is worth the same in the marketplace. You take a janitor who does important services, but then you may have a scientist who's producing vaccines or something, and their economic worth in the marketplace may be vastly different, or the CEO, for example. But in terms of ownership, Kelso was able to disconnect opportunity to own from whatever had been done accumulated in the past. So that a wealthy person today has obviously much more opportunity to become an owner of the new future wealth, artificial intelligence, robotics, et cetera. The poor person who's barely scraping by, who is living hand to mouth or one paycheck away from being on the street, they really can't afford to save up a whole lot in order to invest, to acquire enough capital that if they couldn't work, they could survive off what their capital produced. And that's what Kelso is really looking at, is what is your self-sufficiency of capital ownership? That if you couldn't work tomorrow, would your capital ownership produce enough of an income for you that you could survive? So they looked at this system. You have input, outtake, and then they had a third principle, which they called, and this would be the feedback principle in a system, and they called it the principle of limitation. And what that meant was that no one should be able to acquire so much of the future ownership that no one else can become an owner. So there is, when your benefit is specifically harming other people's equal opportunity, then you got a problem there. And so what do? Do you take it away? Do you tax it all away and redistribute it? Well, Kelso came up with another way of doing this, and that was looking at how we create money. What is the meaning of money? And that's a whole nother discussion. And the use of capital credit, which is different than what most of us have access to, consumer credit. That's how many of us end up in debt, because we buy something that we don't have the means of paying off. We think we do when we, hopefully, when we purchase something with a credit card, but as you can see, many people have fallen into the debt trap, and our governments have fallen into the debt trap, and they tell them so. They tell everyone, and the economists tell us, well, it's okay. Yes, well, it's okay if governments go into debt because they can just print up their own currency and spend it into the economy.
The policy of composition, which is a lot hooey.
Yeah, exactly. So this principle of limitation, we looked at and we said, well, we can understand it's sort of an anti-greed principle, but it's not sufficient. And for many years we were struggling, what is this, harmonic justice, to bring the two sides in balance? What do we call this? And it was fairly recently, I'd say maybe within Mike, the past 5-7 years, I forget.
Yeah, I think so, because I'm looking at some of my old manuscripts and I'm still using harmony and other things.
Yes. We realized that this concept of social justice, which is actually a higher level of justice than economic justice, its principles still operated in terms of, at any level, the common good in any institution. Is there equal opportunity and access to participate? Is there a fair means of distribution? And if not, we got to fix the system. So social justice was the perfect third principle to say, okay, it's constantly monitoring, it's evaluating. Once participation and distribution are out of balance, we've got to fix the system and it's quite often on the participation side that is the problem, because that affects the distribution side. So we realized that, oh my gosh, we had this all this time. But then I had a question, it really bugged me for years, is how can a principle that's the higher level principle of social justice be coming in as one of the three principles of economic justice, which is a lower level? And I was going crazy with this. It just did not make sense to me logically until I remembered Father Ferry said social justice is acting at all levels. So it is acting also at the level of the economy. So that I was able to reconcile that in my own mind. But it's those three principles acting together to enable each human being to access the means to sustain him or herself and the family independently, either through labor or capital ownership, or ideally we think in the future it's going to be both, and probably increasingly more the capital ownership way of participating in the economy.
Yeah. And basically all I can do is summarize what Dawn said, is that as we mentioned, at the very beginning, there is massive confusion today between principle and application of principle. And if you do that, you'll never understand or be able to distinguish economic justice from social justice, because economic justice is an application to the economic milieu of social justice, which is why you have the three principles of economic justice as participation, distribution, and social justice. Well, obviously you need social justice in economic justice, or it's not an application of social justice.
All right, so what is the single most important thing to come out of economic personalism?
I think that it is a practical and principled way for each human being to acquire the means of enhancing and promoting their human dignity and their ability to develop as a human being. And so it's the reconstruction of a system. It's sort of our environment, our institutional environment, to make sure that every human being has equal access to all these social tools, institutions, in order to develop as human beings.
Yeah. And thank you, Dawn, because as you started speaking, I said, I was going to say that. You took my speech. So, basically, it's a practical means to enhance the dignity of every single child, woman, and man on earth.
Okay. So kind of another single most important question. What is the single most important thing the book can do? This book. I think that it outlines an integrated body of principles that shows people that there is a way to
make a better future and for everyone to have hope and have the realistic means to be able to better themselves in their lives. And it clarifies some of the areas and concepts that have become so confused that I think that confusion has led us to a point in human history where there is no such thing as truth. There is no such thing as justice. There is no such thing as love or beauty or whatever. And we're saying, yes, there is. We may not understand it or attain it perfectly, but we have to believe in something that's greater than ourselves. There's something that we all can unify around and strive towards. So that's what I think really the important message of this book is.
Yeah, put it in another way, it's to restore reason and common sense to its proper place as the foundation of human life. Now, yes, we have our emotional and irrational side, but what we're talking about here and in the book is how, based on absolute principles discerned by reason and common sense, which is the basis of the natural law in Aristotelian Thomism. In fact, this is so important that the Catholic Church has defined it as a doctrine, that in the First Vatican Council, and this was one of the reasons why Pius IX called the First Vatican Council, was to do two things: define papal infallibility, which most people misunderstand and we won't get into right here, and the primacy of the intellect. Now, faith is above reason, but it must be consistent with reason. And as the fathers of the First Vatican Council defined, and it was repeated in the Oath Against Modernism and in Humani Generis by Pius XII, absolutely speaking, knowledge of God's existence and of the natural law in the hearts of every single human being can be discerned by the force and light of human reason alone. Now, say that to a lot of Christians and they'll go berserk and scream, you're a heretic, you're a dissenter. We didn't say anything more, and the church fathers weren't saying anything more than you can know that God exists and that there's a natural law, which is God. And you can do this by reason. It didn't say it has been done, only that it can be done.
I do want to add something, Mike. It just occurred to me as you were talking, Steve, your question about what would we hope this book accomplishes. We've been talking about the moral principles and sort of system principles. The book does outline 5 major areas which need to be changed. And that includes money and credit, how we look at that, our tax system, how we look at that, education. What is education meant to do? Is it accomplishing that?
You said indoctrination wrong.
Right, yeah. And technology. And Mike, I always forget the 5th, but there are 5. And so the idea is we're showing people that there's a reasonable way to fix things. It will take people thinking about this, learning more, coming together, developing solutions, and we point to some of those. We touch very lightly. So ultimately, if this book is to serve its purpose, it should inspire people to now see that there are some reasonable things, ideas, ways they can fix the system. And it even points to look at these particular areas. And I think we mentioned in it, for example, a piece of legislation that we've been developing over many decades, actually, and we've renamed it the Economic Democracy Act. But that becomes a way of affecting our monetary systems, our banking and money and credit systems, and our tax systems, so that we end up with equal access and equal opportunity to participate in the economy and receive fair distributions through a free market system, a true free market system. And then we have ongoing ways we can correct problems in the system. And that ultimately, when we talk about economic power, which is, that's a central idea of economic personalism, this is the basis for political power, political democracy. If you don't have economic power spread broadly, you're going to have what we have today. And that's a few very powerful interests manipulating all of us. So it is really a foundation for a just society in all aspects.
Yeah, and I actually had to look it up myself because I have to count them off. But the 5 levers of change are education, politics, money and credit, tax policy, and technology.
Thank you. I always forget those.
Well, I can never remember more than 3. So, I mean, that's why you need to buy the book so you can, or free download it. It is available on Barnes and Noble and Amazon.
Right, and we hope people will spread it around. We hope they'll buy it first, but we hope really the PDF is there for people to share with others.
Yeah, unlike Abby Hoffman, do not steal this book. Just
if you don't like it, well, you have to get it from Amazon. You go to justthrowawayblogspot.com. It'll redirect you to Amazon. At least give Michael a hit on his website and just not.
And then give an adulatory review when you buy the book.
Right,
Yes.
right. It was priced reasonably, so you can get 2 if you want, or multiple and hand them out, right?
Yeah, for Christmas.
And if you can't afford that, we'll give the free PDF. Just download it.
There you go. Michael, Don, appreciate it. We'll have the links below in the show notes to go ahead and get the book and the website for Michael's website and the CESJ.org website as well. So thank you guys for coming on and discussing it.
Oh, thank you so much, Steve. I've really enjoyed this.
No problem. Anytime.